Hey, welcome to the briefing. What I'm going to cover with you today within navigating obstacles rapidly in manufacturing. The sensor said pass. The nut was still loose. The sensor said pass. The physical conditions said otherwise. That is where this one starts. Not with some complicated engineering argument. Not with a boardroom decision. Not with somebody redesigning an entire manufacturing system from the top down. It starts with something a lot more familiar. A process gives you a signal. The signal tells you the work is acceptable. Then something on the floor gives you a reason to question whether that signal deserves your confidence anymore. Now you have a leadership problem, and I want to make the distinction early because it controls everything else we are going to talk about. The first mistake is assuming that because the problem reached you, you are automatically the person who needs to solve every technical part of it, and you are not. You can own the next move without pretending you own every answer inside that move. Those are two different responsibilities, and confusing them is how a leader who is genuinely trying to help can start making the problem worse. General Motors is recalling more than 26,000 model year 2025 and 2026 Chevrolet Express and GMC Savannah vehicles because certain steering gear assemblies may contain a nut that was not properly tightened. According to the public recall information, a malfunctioning part sensor at supplier next year's facility allowed some steering gear assemblies to pass inspection without that nut being properly tightened. In some cases, the nut was only hand tightened. That matters because this was not a cosmetic condition. If the nut separates during operation, steering control can be lost and crash risk can increase. The public record also gives us a useful sequence. A dealer reported a loose nut. A GM brand quality manager submitted the issue through GM's Speak Up for Safety process. GM opened an investigation. The supplier identified the malfunctioning sensor. Torque trace data was reviewed to identify suspect steering gear assemblies. GM identified additional potentially related field issues. No crashes or injuries were reported among those issues, and GM ultimately moved to a safety recall. Now I want to keep the evidence boundary clean. We do not know which supervisor first encountered the manufacturing condition. We do not know the exact conversations inside next year. We do not know who stood at which station, who said what, or exactly how the technical work was assigned. The public information does not establish those things, so I'm not going to manufacture them just to make the story cleaner. A normal inspection process produced a pass signal. A physical condition later showed that at least some assemblies had passed without the expected fastening condition being properly completed. Once that happens, the problem changes. The question becomes, what does pass mean now that the process producing that answer has become part of the uncertainty? That is a very different question. It is also not necessarily a question the production supervisor, shift leader, line lead, or operator should be expected to answer alone. That is where manual engagement becomes relevant. Manual engagement is not the leader taking over everything. It is not the supervisor personally troubleshooting every sensor, control, quality record, maintenance condition, or engineering question that touches the shift. It is targeted human engagement when the blocker requires a capability the normal path does not currently have. That capability might be technical skill. It might be quality authority. It might be system access or equipment history. It might be engineering judgment. It might be authority to make a decision the people currently holding the problem simply do not possess. And this is where the word responsibility can get people in trouble because responsibility does not mean unlimited competence. That sounds obvious when the line is running normally, and we are sitting here talking about it. It becomes much harder when the line is waiting. Production control wants to know what is happening. Quality wants confidence before anything moves. Planning wants to know whether the schedule is still real. Shipping wants to know whether the customer critical order is going to make the window. Maintenance may already be looking at equipment. Operators are waiting for direction. And all of that pressure converges on the supervisor standing closest to the work. I want the leader to feel responsible for the objective. I want the leader to step forward when the team needs direction. I do not want the leader standing 10 feet away from the problem saying, well, that belongs to engineering. You start believing the only way to prove ownership is to personally solve whatever technical question is blocking the shift. That is where good intent can turn into weak judgment. The supervisor starts troubleshooting equipment they do not own. They ask operators to inspect more things without knowing whether the additional inspection actually addresses the failure. They start reading data they do not normally interpret. They call everybody who might know something and build a meeting large enough to make the problem feel important. Pretty soon the supervisor is quality, maintenance, controls, and engineering. Congratulations, you are now 4 departments in a polo shirt. That is the trap. More attention is not the same as the right capability. More people are not the same as the right person. More checks are not automatically better checks. Leadership responsibility does not manufacture technical competence. Let's bring this down to the floor. This next situation is illustrative. It is based on the verified operating condition in the GM and next steer case, but I am not telling you this is what happened inside either organization. You are supervising an assembly area. The shift is already moving. The schedule matters. You have customer commitments downstream. Your operators are following approved work. A station performs an automated check connected to a fastening condition. The station has been producing pass results. The work has been moving. Then an assembly is physically checked and the fastening condition does not match what you would expect from a clean pass. Now everybody is looking at you. That moment matters because several very different problems can suddenly look like one. Maybe the part is wrong. Maybe the fastening process did not complete correctly. Maybe the sensor is not reading correctly. Maybe the inspection logic is wrong. Maybe the trace record is incomplete. Maybe a component condition changed. Maybe the issue is isolated. Maybe it is not. What you do know is that the physical condition and the normal signal no longer agree. That contradiction is enough to change your leadership read. Your first instinct may be to personally figure it out. I need to get to the bottom of this. If getting to the bottom of it means you start acting like the controls engineer, quality engineer, maintenance specialist, and manufacturing engineer all at the same time, you have crossed from leadership ownership into unsupported technical judgment. But if the leader does not possess the technical capability required to answer the blocker, all that visibility does not create a better answer. The other instinct can be just as weak. Everybody check everything. Now every operator is manually inspecting whatever seems related. Someone starts building a list. Somebody else starts checking previous work. Production control starts asking how much output may be affected. Quality is trying to determine what actually matters. Maintenance gets pulled in because equipment might be involved. Planning is waiting on scope. Great. We have reinvented panic with clipboards. More precisely, you are missing the capability required to determine why the signal and the physical condition no longer agree. That is where manual engagement changes the read. The better recognition is not, I need more people on this. It is, this blocker requires a capability the current path does not have. It narrows the problem. It also protects the people who may already be doing their jobs correctly. The operator who discovered the mismatch is not automatically responsible for diagnosing the control system. The supervisor who owns recognizing and escalating the production condition is not automatically responsible for making the engineering determination. The maintenance technician is not automatically the right person simply because a machine is involved. The quality representative is not automatically the right person simply because somebody used the word defect. The required capability depends on what the blocker actually needs. That is why manual engagement is not just escalation. Manual engagement is targeted. You are trying to put the correct human capability on the point the normal path cannot clear. That may be the quality owner, it may be the controls specialist, it may be the maintenance lead who understands the machine history, it may be the manufacturing engineer who understands the process logic, it may be someone with access to trace data, it may be an authority holder who can determine whether the current condition can move through the approved release path. Now go back to the GM case. The public recall record tells us the supplier identified the malfunctioning sensor and reviewed torque trace data to understand which steering gear assemblies may have been affected. Once the inspection signal itself is unreliable, simply repeating the same normal process does not necessarily improve the answer. The organization needed technical identification of the sensor issue. It needed access to relevant trace information. It needed people capable of interpreting what those records meant. Eventually, it needed decision authority strong enough to act on the resulting risk. The leadership lesson is knowing when your normal operating path has reached a blocker that requires somebody with a different capability. You do not have to become the expert. You have to recognize when the blocker requires one. If a supervisor keeps personally taking over technical blockers, the operation starts learning the wrong leadership model. Every unusual problem goes to the supervisor. Every difficult question goes upward. Every condition outside the normal process becomes management work. The specialists enter later. The team waits longer. The supervisor becomes the default point of intervention for problems they were never meant to own indefinitely. And that should bother you, because eventually that person becomes the memory, the decision path, the exception process, the translator, the escalation path, and the technical middleman for half the building. Then when that supervisor's off shift, suddenly nobody knows how anything works. That is dependency with a name badge. Congratulations. Your process is now a guy named Steve. The right person handles the blocker. Their engagement stays connected to the specific capability that is missing. Then the larger work returns to the lowest risk suitable path. That person may need to determine what the sensor is doing. They may need access to a history the supervisor does not have. They may need to establish whether the signal deserves confidence. But that does not mean the controls specialist now owns customer communication, staffing, production planning, quality containment, shift direction, and schedule recovery. The blocker needs their capability. The operation still needs leadership. That is what makes targeted human engagement different from a takeover. They hold the operating picture. The affected work still needs control under approved procedures. Quality still needs a defensible basis for the next decision. Planning still needs accurate status. Customer-facing teams still need information they can trust. The shift still needs direction. Production wants movement. Quality wants confidence. Maintenance wants a clear failure condition. Planning wants scope. Shipping wants timing. Leadership wants control. If the technical blocker remains unresolved, everybody starts filling the gap with assumptions. Production assumes the issue is isolated. Quality assumes the affected population may be broader. Planning assumes output is at risk. Shipping assumes the customer window may move. Maintenance assumes equipment needs investigation. The plant has now developed a multiverse, and somehow every universe is behind schedule. The first consequence is delay. The second is disagreement. Then separate responses begin forming. Someone starts checking previous work. Someone pauses new work. Someone else says the line can continue. Someone starts collecting data. Someone communicates a tentative status downstream. Now, you do not have one blocker anymore. You have the original blocker plus the consequences created by everybody trying to solve it from their own position. That can become a second operating problem very quickly. If the inspection signal is no longer trustworthy, who can determine why? If the answer depends on trace history, who has access? If the technical meaning is unclear, who has the judgment to interpret it? If the release decision requires authority outside the supervisor's role, who holds that authority? Because the pressure to personally solve things gets stronger when you are still proving yourself. You want to be useful. You want the team to trust you. You want your manager to know you can handle pressure. You do not want to look like you are passing the problem off. You start making calls. You start offering technical opinions. You start telling people what you think the problem probably is. You start doing work that belongs to people with capabilities you do not have, because saying, I need the technical owner, somehow feels like weakness. Sometimes leadership is recognizing the point where your competence stops and your responsibility changes shape. That is operating discipline. There is a major difference between handing away responsibility and routing a blocker to the person capable of clearing it. Think about a quality hold. A supervisor may own protecting the operation and making sure affected work does not move outside the approved path. That does not mean the supervisor should personally determine whether a technical specification has been satisfied when that decision belongs to quality or engineering. The leader owns what falls inside their role. The specialist owns the judgment requiring specialized capability. Manual engagement connects those things without confusing them. The issue reaches a blocker. The normal process does not clear it. So another email goes out, then another meeting, then another escalation. The team is waiting for authority nobody present has, or technical judgment nobody present has, or access nobody present has. You could schedule another meeting, but that is not really the decision. The decision is whether the people in that meeting possess the capability required to move the blocker. If they do not, congratulations, you now have a larger meeting with the same problem. That is not escalation. That is a corporate escape room. Everybody is searching for clues. Nobody has the key. Coordination cannot manufacture decision rights. A meeting cannot create technical competence. An email cannot create system access. A status update cannot create trust. Now, I also want to protect the opposite boundary because this tool can be abused very easily. Manual engagement is not permission to bypass normal process because a leader prefers dealing directly with somebody they know. If the normal process can handle the issue, use the process. If the quality path works, use the quality path. If maintenance can address the issue through approved work, use maintenance. If the required authority is already present, you do not need to invent some special engagement. This tool is not an excuse for impatience. The blocker has to genuinely require capability the current path does not have. Everything becomes exceptional. Every problem needs a specialist. Every decision needs the manager. Every issue gets a direct phone call. Normal ownership weakens. People stop trusting or using the process because they know somebody can always step around it. The specialist becomes overloaded. The leader becomes the routing center for every exception. The organization starts losing the very capability it was trying to protect. Manual engagement should clear the blocker. It should not train the system to depend on constant intervention. That is why the return matters. The work has to move back into a controlled path once the blocker is handled. I am deliberately not walking you through the full method here. There's a deeper process for identifying the blocker, determining the required capability, matching the person, defining boundaries, establishing the expected output, reassessing what happened, and returning the work to the appropriate problem path. That belongs inside the training. For this briefing, the recognition level is enough. What is actually stuck? What capability is missing? Do the people currently holding the problem possess that capability? And if they do not, who does? Then keep leading the rest of the operation. That is the practical standard. The line has been running. The station says pass. Then the physical condition says something else. The problem is the sensor. No, that is too narrow. The sensor is where the technical failure became visible in this case. The leadership problem is what happens when people are held responsible for a condition they did not have the information, authority, or technical capability to resolve. This is where justice matters, in leadership, whether you ever use that word or not. You have to connect accountability to what the person actually knew, what authority they actually had, what process they were given, and what was genuinely within their control. If the process said pass, be very careful about punishing the people who followed that process before you understand why the process produced the wrong answer. That is not lowering the standard. That is applying the standard correctly. The operator owns execution inside the approved standard they were given. The supervisor owns recognizing the operating condition and getting the issue into the correct path inside their authority. The specialist owns the technical judgment that requires specialized competence. Leadership owns making sure those responsibilities do not get mixed together simply because the schedule is under pressure. If the first operator who notices a contradiction gets blamed for the contradiction, the next operator learns to keep quiet. If the supervisor who escalates a technical issue gets criticized for not personally solving it, the next supervisor learns to overreach. If the specialist gets handed the entire production problem every time they are engaged, they eventually learn that helping means inheriting everything. Now, the organization has taught everybody to protect themselves from the problem instead of protecting the objective. Apparently, the only thing the process can route correctly is blame. That is unacceptable. You want people close to the work to identify the mismatch. You want the supervisor to recognize when the normal process has lost confidence. You want technical owners to enter when their capability is genuinely required. You want authority applied at the correct point, and you want the work returned to normal ownership when the blocker is cleared. And that is what clean manual engagement supports. I have learned over time that one of the harder leadership disciplines is knowing the difference between stepping up and stepping into work. You do not actually have the competence or authority to own. Those can feel almost identical in the moment. The team needs an answer. The line is waiting. Something is wrong. You are responsible, so you move. I respect that instinct. I would rather work with somebody who feels responsible than somebody who hides from the problem. But the quality of that move depends on whether you understand your boundary. Stepping up means owning the next responsible decision. Stepping into everything means assuming ownership gives you competence you may not have. Those are not the same thing. And I think leaders sometimes resist that distinction because they think it makes them look less capable. It does not. Knowing when a problem has crossed your technical or authority boundary is a capability. A good leader does not disappear when the expert arrives. They also do not compete with the expert. They hold the operating picture, they protect the objective, they keep the team aligned, they keep information clean, they make sure the specialist can access the blocker, they make sure the rest of the shift is not inventing 5 different responses while the technical question is being worked. And when the blocker is cleared, they bring the work back into the appropriate operating path. That is leadership. Now bring the GM case back into focus. The value is the contradiction. The inspection process had allowed assemblies to pass. A physical condition later showed that at least some assemblies had not been tightened as intended. The response required more than another ordinary pass through the same mechanism. The investigation needed technical identification of the sensor condition. It needed trace information. It needed people capable of determining what that information meant. Eventually, it needed decision authority strong enough to act on the resulting risk. When your signal and your physical condition stop agreeing, do not pretend you know more than you know. Do not keep trusting the same signal simply because it is the signal you normally use. Do not tell everybody to check harder without understanding what confidence you are trying to restore. Do not personally become the engineer because the engineer is not standing next to you. Recognize what capability the blocker requires. Then get that capability onto the point that is actually stuck. That is manual engagement. CSA matters first because you need a clean read of what changed, what is confirmed, what is assumed, what signal has lost confidence, what part of the objective is now exposed. That cleaner CSA read gives Deepin something useful to work with. Deepin helps determine what kind of response the obstacle actually requires. Not every blocker needs manual engagement. Some issues can be postponed, some can be stabilized, some can be redirected, some require direct intervention. But when the limiting point is a human capability, when someone with the correct authority, access, skill, judgment, or trust is the missing control, manual engagement becomes the stronger fit. From there, risk still matters, so the tool does not stand alone. But manual engagement remains the center. The blocker needs a human capability the current path does not possess. Now think about where that appears in your operation. Maybe it is a maintenance condition the general supervisor cannot interpret, a quality release question requiring authority the shift does not hold, a material concern needing engineering review, or a system issue requiring access your team does not possess. Maybe the same recurring problem keeps going through meetings because everybody is discussing it and nobody present owns the point that can actually move it. The recognition question stays the same. What capability is missing? Not who is nearby, not who is the loudest, not who has the most senior title, not who normally gets called. What does this blocker actually require? Then ask a second question. What part of this still belongs to me? That matters because manual engagement is not surrender. If you are the production supervisor, you may still own team direction, accurate status, schedule coordination inside your authority, and keeping the operation from drifting while the specialist handles the blocker. You are not giving the whole problem away. You are refusing to pretend leadership responsibility means technical omniscience. So here's the field level read I want you carrying into the next shift. When normal process stops producing confidence, ask what is actually stuck. Ask what the current team knows for certain. Ask what capability is missing from the current path. Then ask who can provide that capability without taking over the entire problem. What you need to understand is the part that matters here is not whether you can personally produce an answer. It is whether you can get the blocker to the capability required to produce a responsible answer. The sensor said pass. The nut was still loose. That contradiction changed the problem. The answer was not simply more confidence in the original signal. It required the right technical capability to determine what that signal now meant. That is the lesson. More hands on the problem do not guarantee the right hands are on the blocker. Coordination cannot manufacture technical competence. Leadership is not personally solving everything that reaches your shift. It is knowing what you own, recognizing what capability the blocker requires, and getting that capability onto the point that is actually stuck. Then you keep leading. Every expert needs to own the problem. Well, not the whole problem. The expert needs to own the part that requires their capability. The leader still owns the operating picture and the objective. And once the blocker is cleared, you return the work to the lowest risk path that can responsibly carry it forward. You do not have to become the expert. You have to recognize when the blocker requires one. When you are ready to go deeper with this tool, go to www.direct-action-system.io/course-directory. Open the course directory, find the course tied to this tool, and start there. That is where the deeper application belongs. Thanks for listening to the briefing.